Okay, good evening, everyone. It is Wednesday, June the 9th. It is 7 o'clock in London, 8 o'clock in Europe, 9 o'clock in Israel, also 8 o'clock in South Africa, and 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Eastern United States. This is the Voice of the Cantor, and this is our number 8 Voice of the Cantor, which is Who Needs a Shul Choir? I'm Russell Grossman. I'm one of the executives at the European Cantors Association. Just want to give you just a couple of words about the European Cantors Association for those who may not be familiar with it. The European Cantors Association is an independent organization established in the United Kingdom in 2012. It's a framework for cantors, prayer leaders, and interested lay people across the spectrum of Jewish worship to engage in dialogue, training, and profile raising to ensure that the beautiful and unique music of Jewish prayer continues to enhance synagogue services for future generations. ECA arranges conventions in the UK and European cities and is presenting this Zoom series, The Voice of the Cantor. Its academic wing presents international conferences on the music of Jewish prayer in partnership with universities around the world. And now to our moderator this evening, that is Daniel Tunkel. Daniel has had a lifelong interest in synagogue music and in particular choral singing. He is currently a member of the Zemel Choir in London and has sung in the past 20 years with the Zamir Choral in New York, the Jerusalem Great Synagogue Choir, the Ne'ima Singers, and the choir of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogues in London, as well as numerous pickup ensemble. He has composed and arranged a large volume of music for male, mixed voice, and children's choirs. Daniel practices law at the London firm of Memory Crystal, where he specializes in financial regulation and investment funds. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I just wanted to say that if I've got any credentials to be the moderator tonight, it's because I have quite frankly been an avid participant in choirs of one sort or another for at least the last 50 years, if we kindly ignore perhaps the last 15 months. And it is something I think which is thoroughly enthusing and enthralling and exhilarating. And for anybody listening today who's never had the experience but likes to sing, I thoroughly recommend it. Once we come out of this awful pandemic and start to get choral singing back to normal again, there's bound to be some sort of choir or ensemble near where you are. Go join it, it's great fun. The sessions in our Voice of the Cantor series so far have primarily concentrated on cantors, cantorial music, the cantors as an institution, and of course we've compared notes with a number of established and up-and-coming cantors who've kindly given time to be on our panels and tell us a bit about what motivates them. We wanted to have one session, this is really more at my instigation perhaps than my colleagues on the ECA committee, but we wanted to have one session that looked specifically at that other component that has been very dominant in synagogue music for the last couple of hundred years, namely the Shul choir, the synagogue choir. To set the scene very quickly, we have 5 directors of different synagogue choirs in our panel. I'm going to introduce briefly in a minute, but I thought perhaps we'd just do a tiny bit of history first. It is fair comment to say that the Jews had a choir before they had cantors, and that's because there was a choir in the temple in Jerusalem, about which and concerning whose actual musical repertoire we know, frankly, very little indeed. There's some evidence of choral singing in the Middle Ages. If one finds illuminated manuscripts of psalters and various other scriptures, you very often find little pictures in the margins which seem to indicate individuals or groups singing liturgical music together. But again, we really don't know what that sounded like. I think probably the first that we can pin down is the choir that Salomone Rossi ran in the synagogue in Ferrara at the end of the 16th century, where he composed a lot of music in the late Renaissance polyphonic style, all of which survives and is much beloved of Jewish art music choirs around the world today, but is generally not regarded as having revolutionized the synagogue service because it fell out of use pretty much at the end of his lifetime. So the choir that we have today is really a construct of the 19th century. The first really successful example was Salomon Sulzer in Vienna in the 1820s. He worked for the Orthodox and put together a choir of men and boys, composed music for them, which, subject to the exigencies of Jewish nusach, was substantially in the Schubertian style and therefore had a very contemporary feel to it. And within a generation, what Sulzer did in Vienna with his contemporaries there revolutionized the way synagogues conducted their services all over Europe. And you have the cantorial choral double act dominating synagogue worship, not just the Orthodox, but the Reform as well. And progressively, the Reform, in its egalitarian sense, started introducing choirs of men and women. The Orthodox stuck to men and boys, but by and large, you've still had solid 4-part harmony. And these choirs would have been rigorously trained. I think we will probably say the heyday of that movement is the mid to late 19th century. You still have Sulzer going strong in Vienna, with Lewandowski in Berlin, Mombach in London, Naumburg in Paris, to name but four. And a huge amount of their music still survives and is sung today and is much loved for people who know these sort of things. The choir changes things socially. For a start, synagogue architecture changes to accommodate the choir and possibly an organ as well. And the choir becomes a social magnet in communities where the synagogue is far more central to Jewish communal and social life than it is perhaps today. It becomes a badge of honor for little boys to sing in their synagogue choirs. And of course, the choirs of one generation are the breeding grounds for the cantors and musical professionals of the next. How many cantorial biographies probably contain a sentence in the beginning that say that at a young age, he sang with cantor so-and-so in the such and such choir at the great synagogue of wherever it was. That was a standard credential for the way in which people got into their Jewish music. And yet, the 20th century, for a variety of reasons, has seen substantial change wrought on that construct. I don't think we need to dwell upon the ravages of the Holocaust at any great length here. And by saying that, I'm not belittling it either, for goodness sake. But I think we're concentrating here perhaps more on internal organs for change. People perhaps are starting to look for a different quality of service, maybe shorter, maybe less demonstrative, maybe more participational. We've heard from cantors during the course of this series of sessions that they have felt under pressure with the way in which they function in the synagogue, and they, damn it, are the paid professionals. They're the people who've had the training. The choirs are generally comprised of individuals from communities. They're amateurs volunteering their time. And is that wanted anymore? Has the choir that we knew from that era outlived its usefulness? It's fair comment to say that Sulzer could compose in the genre of his musical time, but contemporary popular music may not lend itself in the same sort of way. People want shorter services. I think we're also finding to an extent that the preservation of synagogue music that is no longer welcome in the forum for which it was created has become the concert stage. Is that the right thing to do, or is that a retreat from where we ought to be? Perhaps what I would say here is we can micro-encapsulate this by saying that I bet that anybody listening to this presentation has at some stage or another been involved in a synagogue or a service where at one moment you hear someone say, same old rubbish every week, and at another moment, maybe the same person or a different one says, they're singing new music, how am I supposed to join in? Now, you and I know that those two statements are contradictory, but we're Jews and we love our contradictions and we live for them. And to help us to examine some of those contradictions, I'd like to invite our panel. First of all, my old friend, Alan Freedman. Alan was a member of and then conductor of the choir at the Raleigh Close Synagogue in Hendon, North London, for many years, and is now the musical director of the London Cantorial Singers, a group that has achieved significant reputation for concert performances with visiting cantors, all-male voice group drawn from what I suppose might say is the remains of a lot of the synagogue choral artistry in the London area. Ben Wolfe, I know personally from his conducting the Zemmel Choir in London, London's principal mixed voice Jewish art music choir. But I wanted Ben to participate today perhaps more because of his role as director of music at Belsize Square Synagogue. That's an unusual community in that it was founded more or less entirely by refugees from Nazi Germany who brought with them the Reform synagogue tradition of Lewandowski and his contemporaries. And that has been perpetuated there with some faithfulness and talent. But Ben will tell us whether perhaps the demography of that community and the pressures from within it are changing that function now, or whether Lewandowski can outride all of that in all its majesty. We now say Dobry wieczór to Sasha Tsaliuk from Moscow. Sasha founded in 1989 what I believe is now known as the Moscow Jewish Male Voice Choir. This has been the backbone of the Moscow Jewish cantorial choral scene and has obviously been a very important organ in the rejuvenation of Jewish musical and perhaps Jewish communal life in Russia in the post-communist era. I'm sure that Sasha will have plenty to say to us about that. We didn't think that Moscow was quite far enough to go for our panel representation tonight, so we're now going to go to Johannesburg and welcome Evelyn Green. Evelyn is the music director of the Johannesburg Jewish Male Choir, another of the world's great seminal Jewish male voice performance groups that many of you will have heard in concert all over the world. and have made many recordings with visiting and touring cantors. But Evelyn has been very much more involved in the organization, training and upskilling of Jewish choirs throughout South Africa in what I think many people regard as one of the more illustrious and artistically self-sufficient diaspora Jewish communities. And our fifth panelist is Ruti Worrall. Ruti was born in Israel and has a music degree from the Rubin Academy, but has been based in the UK for quite some time. And for the purposes of tonight's presentation, because she's actually sent me a CV with a lot of artistic credits in it, but for the purposes of tonight's presentation, Ruti comes to us as the musical director at the Menorah Synagogue, which is a very substantial Reform Jewish community serving South Manchester and North Cheshire. Thank you very much, everybody, for giving your time this evening. What I'd like to suggest is that we go through the panel one at a time so that you each have a chance to say a little bit more about who you are, what your background is, what your influences are, what stimulates you to be so deeply involved with Jewish choral music and what you feel you bring to it. Alan, perhaps we could start with you.
Yes, of course. Good evening, everyone, and I just say delighted I am to be part of the panel here this evening. My family had no real musical background or tradition or active involvement in Shul music, either in choirs or as chazonim. It's something I had to strike out on my own. And from a very early age, I found that I could pick up songs of all types quite easily and quickly. I have two older sisters, one 9 years older and one 13 years older. And when I was small, they were teenagers. They were big fans of the Beatles, and I was picking up all the early Beatles songs. And they were taking me to Shul every week, because unfortunately my dad had to work on a Shabbos morning. So it was they who took me to Shul, and on a weekly basis I was hearing the same usual songs that sung on a Shabbos morning in Shul. I soon picked them up. And unfortunately, my father passed away when I was 8 years old. So I had no one to sit with in the Shul. Although I went to the children's service, I didn't really seem to get on there. But I was aware of the choir's existence. And wandering around the Shul aimlessly one summer morning, on a Shabbos morning as a 9-year-old, I found myself in the choir room. And I was challenged as to my presence by the austere, strict choir master, Lionel Lee. Why are you here? What are you doing here? So I had to justify my presence somehow, and I knew that I could sing, and so I mumbled something about expressing an interest in joining the Shul choir. Well, it was summer. He told me to come back Shabbos Bereshis after the Chagim. I did, and things went from there really. So bit by bit, I enjoyed it, picked up all the choir songs, and I found it increasingly fulfilling, to the extent that when my voice broke, although I couldn't sing for a year or three, he let me be a spectator in the choir room until I could come back as a bass, which I did. So that's how I got involved in the choir tradition. Would it be appropriate at this stage, Daniel, if I said a little bit about how I got involved in the conducting side of things, which is quite a separate and interesting story?
We'll deal with that in a minute, because I'm sure there's a very good story there too. I'd like to suggest perhaps Ben can tell us a little bit how he got involved, how a nice laureate from Dulwich College and Oxford, I think it was, managed to get involved in the Jewish music scene when perhaps much else outside the Jewish world also beckoned.
How did I get into Jewish music and Jewish conducting? Yes, my background actually singing-wise, as Daniel suggested, is actually more based in church music than in synagogue music. After university and after conducting training, I became more interested in Jewish music, though I did also actually sing with my synagogue choir as a child, which was Bromley Reform, and through high holidays and things of that kind. And then I'll give Geraldine her plug. Partly through the JMI Millennium Awards, I became increasingly interested from the conducting point of view and compositional point of view. And then I became conductor of Zemmel. And then from there, I subsequently became conductor at Hendon Reform, and from there moved to Belsize. So my background chorally in Jewish terms is what Daniel was discussing, really. It was that quite solid Reform liturgy, Mombach, Lewandowski, things of that kind that came through the British Reform liturgy, and then much more Lewandowski once I moved to Belsize. And I think that's all I'll say for now.
Let's hold it there. Thank you. Sasha, so you founded a Jewish male voice choir in Moscow on the cusp of the end of communism, and you've kept it going for 30 years or so. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, good evening, dear friends. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this show tonight. Okay, so I was born in 1970 in the very Soviet time in this country. And of course, all Jewish activity was almost forbidden here. But my grandfather, since 1914, was a member of the Moscow Grand Choral Synagogue. He was born in Belarus, in Belarusia, and he studied together at the same Heder with Mark Chagall, as I already mentioned. And his grandparents were very, very Jewish oriented. All of them were rabbis, cantors, you know, deeply involved in the Jewish life before the revolution of 1917. So in 1989, when I was 19 years old, I was a student of the Moscow Tchaikovsky Conservatory, which I graduated twice as a choral conductor and symphony conductor. A grandfather invited me and introduced me to the chief rabbi of Soviet Union, Mr. Adolf Shayevich. He's still today here with us. And now I actually want to say a couple of words about history of our choir, if you don't mind.
No, please do.
Yeah, so as I say, the choir was born in 1989. A group of American philanthropists, including the chief rabbi of the Park East Synagogue in New York, Mr. Arthur Schneier, chief cantor of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue in New York, Mr. Joseph Malavani, and well-known American philanthropist and lover of cantorial music, Chaim Wiener, came to Moscow. Together with them, a famous president of American Joint GDC office, Ralph Goldman. He also, came here in this delegation. And Ralph Goldman was a very smart man. He visited many countries of the former USSR, republics, and he knew the situation already. When he came to Russia, he immediately realized that there are a huge Jewish diaspora here, which for 70 years of Soviet era was completely divorced from Jewish life, from Jewish traditions, from Jewish culture and religion. But these people were the best slice of intelligentsia in this country. There were famous doctors, engineers, teachers, cultural workers, people who constantly visited exhibitions, concerts, went to museums and concert halls. And Ralph Goldman immediately realized that in order to attract these people to the synagogue or communities and cultural centers, you need to give them right food and the material that they are used to, and they will not shock them. And it will be very difficult to attract these people directly to the synagogue and introduce them to their religious roots. Thus, he came up with an idea of recreating a Jewish choir in the community and in the synagogue. And with help of concerts of the choir, which will perform both works of Jewish liturgical music as well Yiddish songs and modern Israeli songs, through these concerts, people will be able to return to the community and perhaps join religious life, join communities and synagogues. Before the revolution of 1917, there were a large professional Jewish male voice choir in Moscow, Choral Synagogue. More than 60 people sang in this choir, including singers, many of whom were professionals, students and teachers of the Moscow Conservatory and other music universities here, as well as singers who worked in Moscow theaters. This choir, unfortunately, was closed and destroyed right after the revolution. Many of these people simply died, and the materials, particularly the scores, were arrested by KGB. When the aforementioned delegation came to Moscow and met with Chief Rabbi of Soviet Union, it was decided to ask the country's president, Mikhail Gorbachev, to give a special permission to recreate the choir in the synagogue. And also, Gorbachev was asked to declassify the KGB archives with the arrested materials in the 30s during the time of Stalin, and to gain access to these unique books and music, which were mostly in manuscripts. At that time, I was very young. As I said, I was only 19 years old. I remember how we went to the archive of the Lenin Library in the center of Moscow, and in the basement, deep basement in the Russian metro system, subway, in a huge building, they took out cards with boxes, ordinary old card box, yellow boxes as we call them, which were covered with a seal made of sealing wax. These boxes were opened for the first time since 1930s, and fantastic materials were discovered there, which were books, dictionaries, sidurs, prayer books, calendars. Also, there were found unique musical manuscripts in handwriting, according to which that wonderful choir sang before the revolution. And Joseph Malovany asked to make a Xerox. Remember, it was 1989. For a couple of Marlboro cigarette blocks, an officer from KGB made a rotoprint. You remember this old machine, rotoprint,
Oh, yes.
you know, of some of this music, and the color of ink were green.
That's right.
So yes, so we call these copies later a Greenpeace, Greenpeace music.
Evelyn, as they say in the classics, beat that. What are you getting up to in South Africa? How are the Johannesburg Jewish Male Choir hanging on, and indeed the choral traditions of the community?
Well, firstly, good evening, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to serve on this illustrious panel. I've had a very interesting career. I started off, and I am essentially a classical pianist, and I played concertos with the orchestra. My great love was to accompany opera singers, and I had the privilege of working as a repetiteur for the opera companies, one in Johannesburg and one in Cape Town, which is the two biggest cities in South Africa. But I always had an interest in Jewish music, going to Shul every Shabbat and every Yom Tov, but never really got involved to that extent. I was invited when I was just about 29, 30, which was just a couple of years ago, only joking, to become an organist with Bob Borowski, formed his own synagogue choir. He was one of South Africa's greatest baritones. And I was doing a concert with him and late Doris Brash. And he invited me, he said he was forming his own Shul choir and he would like me to become the organist. And I said, me, I don't know anything about Jewish music. He said, you're going to do it and you're going to learn. So I started playing weddings from 1977 and became like the organist in almost all the big shuls in Johannesburg. And I would say the turning point in my career was the opportunity to meet late Chazan Johnny Gluck. He really turned my life into a 360-degree circle. And ultimately through him, I became well known amongst all the other Chazonim in Johannesburg. They all started coming to me for lessons, and it was just wonderful. Really wanted to get to a point where I wanted to put a sign outside my house, Chazan's Corner, because every hour there would be a different Chazan coming for a lesson. Wow. I also did work with a number of different shul choirs, and sadly, when late Johnny passed away, we formed in his memory the Johannesburg Jewish Male Choir, of which I am one of the founder members. It was formed by late Gus Levy, Bob Borowski, who's living in Sydney now, going to be 92 next week, Leo Himmelstein, and myself. And I then became very, very involved. I was the accompanist, still am, the repetitor, the musical arranger, and honorary secretary and treasurer. And then in 2005, I was given this wonderful honor of becoming the musical director of the JJMC, which I am still today. And very proud to be involved with Jewish music. I just love it. It's part of my life
basically
now.
Holding the Jewish choral scene together in South Africa, if I can summarize that in a
Trying to, under very difficult circumstances, I'm afraid.
Ruti, how does a nice Israeli girl trained at the Rubin Academy come to be running a choir at a substantial Reform synagogue in the north of England? And what
so let me first of all correct you. It's not the Rubin Academy, that's the Jerusalem one.
Oh,
I'm a graduate of the Tel Aviv Academy of Music. And just in case you're thinking they're somehow inferior, let me tell you that students who studied with me included Zuckerman and Perlman. So
okay.
doing quite well.
On that one, I'm invariably going to get this sort of thing.
Yes, it's okay. So yes, my background is completely classical. And when I finished the academy, I went to the army, and the army sent me to be a teacher in schools where, although my military service was not combative, if you saw some of the school, you would think maybe it was. And that's where I started working with choirs and also doing drama. Because and later on, when I left the army, I taught more in the Tel Aviv area, in middle schools in Kiryat Ono, did again choirs and drama and so forth. I met my husband, who was playing cello in the chamber orchestra in Israel, and he brought me to England. He's English. And when I came here, I took on the choir of North Cheshire Jewish Primary School for quite a few years. They were quite well known in England. They were a fabulous choir. While at the same time, for 7 years, I had the choir of Israeli women called Shortwaves. And they actually performed on the Richard and Judy program on television, because they heard us somewhere and invited us.
How interesting.
And yes, and then I was asked by Rabbi Fox to come and do, just to save them their high holidays. So it was going to be a 4-month gig 19 years ago, and I'm still there. Will that do for now?
Kind of said that's almost as good as Salomon Sulzer. He took a 6-week break in Vienna and stayed for 55 years. But okay, fine, fair enough. Very interesting. We've got a very colourful, varied set of credentials there, I would say. What I suggested we were going to do next, perhaps, is to ask our participants to say something a little bit, recording where we are actually at the moment, just emerging from the worst of the pandemic and looking forward to perhaps normal choral rehearsal and performance and concert in a matter of weeks or months, I don't know. But tell us a little bit more about the way in which you've had to work over the last, is it 15, 18 months? I don't know, it's going to depend from one place to another, to try and hold choirs together. I think choirs as institutions have been disproportionately badly affected in terms of what they can do by the pandemic, because a cantor could go on Zoom and sing into the camera and be listened to, but it's exceptionally difficult for choirs to do that. I know that Ben has been doing some work with the Zemel Choir on Zoom. So Ben, perhaps I can start with you on that one.
So the pandemic has obviously been quite difficult. Zemel has continued with Zoom rehearsals, which actually means that everybody is muted. So I haven't actually heard the choir together for over a year, though we are actually going to do some outdoor singing, which is legal this weekend. So that will be the first time that I hear the choir. Zemel is obviously a more or less a concert choir, so it doesn't quite fit into the Shul choir remit of this evening's session. Belsize has also been doing things online, a lot of things, both broadcasting services, and also we ended up actually doing choir recordings that we broadcast for services when the choir was not allowed to be in the building. I would say the pandemic, if we're focusing on that rather than normal life, from the Belsize perspective, has been okay for the professionals. Belsize has a youth choir, a community choir, and a professional choir. Partly because some of them have been paid through the furlough scheme, and partly because they are allowed to sing. I think it's been unbelievably difficult for the community choir and the youth choir because they basically haven't been able to sing. And so I think once we go back to quote unquote normal, it's going to be an interesting experiment, maybe not experiment, it's going to be more of a challenge than usual to make sure that the singers come back and that we can keep that aspect of the synagogue music going.
Sasha, how's the pandemic grabbed you in Moscow? What have you been able to do?
You know, plus to the corona restrictions, we had for almost all the years of our existence big problems with the financing, with the financial support, because all singers are professionals in my choir. We are getting a small salary for the rehearsals. So before we were locked with the corona, I had lots of problems with getting financial help for paying singers for the rehearsals. And actually we could survive only with help of foreign tours, for the, you know, with help of festivals, recordings, mostly, you know, outside of Russia. So we were lucky enough right before closing to perform in UNESCO in Paris in January 2020. And then we performed In Hanover, we participate in night oratorio by late glance. Actually, I was amazed how singers, non-Jewish singers from from all over the world, from the German choir, were singing together with us in Hebrew language, and how they got fun from that. So when we were locked here, we almost like died. We participated in one Zoom project. We sang Avinu Shabashamayim with, you probably remember this project. We sang as a choir to accompany like 19 cantors from all over the world.
Oh, yes.
Yes, in this project made by Moti Hasfari, the Cantorial internet, very big website.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we did that. It was exceptionally well and very interesting project. Also, we participated in September, at the Great Hall of the Moscow Tchaikovsky Conservatory. We made a recording. We sang Ba'avor Dovid, which I sent you the file, the link, organized by American Embassy. They made the TV bridge between the Bolshoi Theater and Metropolitan Opera, a youth opera singers, youth programs, and we participate as a Jewish choir with our cantor Uriel Granat. It was dedicated to the end of the Second World War project. So that's basically all. Now we start again. We are back to the rehearsals, to the normal rehearsals, physically, not in Zoom. We just sang a big, huge concert here in Moscow. We participated in Giovanni Bottesini Requiem. We sang together with the Moscow Oratorio Diplomatic Corps Choir, which I conduct for 28 years also, as well as a Jewish choir. So with big symphony orchestra, we did it, dedicated to all victims of the coronavirus in the world, this requiem.
Right, okay. So in other words, you're already starting to get back to normal.
More or less, but again,
but like all the rest of us,
financial.
Well, the finances is another story. I guess we'll talk about finances for choirs in a minute,
yes,
because that could be an interesting subject in itself. But
yes,
it's nice to hear perhaps that in Russia they're moving towards restoring regular rehearsals. I have a feeling that it may take until the autumn in London. I don't know. But we will say, what's happening in South Africa? How is the pandemic working out there? And do we foresee choirs being on hold there for a while? Evelyn?
Well, sadly, South Africa has gone into its third wave. So they've placed a number of, and we've gone up another level of lockdown. We have a curfew from 11 at night until 4 in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
No singing, no concerts, reduced gathering. The attendance at Shul's, if you daven inside, 100 people. Outside, you can have a minyan outside. And so, very sadly, nothing has really happened this year. I tried once to do a rehearsal on Zoom, but the choristers are all amateurs, and it's very, very difficult. Yes. So, regrettably, COVID is really kind of putting a nail in the coffin as far as choral music is concerned. One or two of the Shuls have been doing Kabbalat Shabbat services on Zoom, but that's just been the chazan on his own, yes, or maybe with one or two choristers in their own respective homes. But choral singing at the moment is on hold, as is all Shul choirs in services, sadly so. And I don't know when it's going to pick up, because only a very small percentage of the population has been vaccinated. And I think only when everyone has been vaccinated, hopefully we will be able to get back to some sort of normality.
Yes.
So it's a tough situation at the moment, unfortunately.
It's going to be a lag for you for a few months yet, at least, I should think.
At least.
Okay. Alan, what have you managed to do with the cantorials?
Well, there's 4 things. Before the pandemic struck, reasonably well. We had comics, concerts, performances with a fair degree of frequency we were preparing for, and we had, as many choirs have, a choral repertoire that we tend to fall back on for many such events. And for a while I felt at the expense of the time to learn some new pieces. So my passion, my overriding passion when the pandemic struck was, we're not going to be actually concerts or preparing for a while. What a wonderful opportunity to bring in some new pieces, widen our repertoire. So we brought in a system for that. First of all, I wrote the arrangements, and then I appointed section leaders to go through their parts with them, and cascaded through them to go through one-to-one with the rest of the choir. And that way, really, for the best part of the last year, that's what one core activity that has been happening, that I've been delighted about, and we've managed to add a good 5-6 pieces that way, which I hope we will be able to roll out once things get more back to normal and we reconvene in person. That's number one. Number two, our chairman and former conductor, David Bruce, has kept the choir together in another way on the weekly occasions, Wednesday evening that we would normally have been rehearsing at 8 p.m, which would have included this Wednesday evening. And in place of that, a lot of the members of the choir hopefully are tuned into this session. But on other Wednesday evenings, on a very regular basis, almost weekly, David has convened an organized Zoom session on a social basis, a non-musical basis, but centered around a number of themes. Sometimes he's had guest speakers, which have included the likes of our co-patron Jeffrey Schissler and Judge Rinder, who also takes a very keen interest in Jewish music. So guest speakers like that. We've had sessions where individual members of the choir have regaled us with tales of their day jobs, both present and past. We've had quizzes, stuff like that, social stuff. And it's been a great success in keeping us all together over months. That's number two. Last summer, in common with what many choirs have done during the COVID period, we put together a patchwork recording of Avinu Sheba Shamayim by Soul Zim, and posted it on our YouTube website, and YouTube page, should I say. And number four, staying with our YouTube page, we have been busy adding videos of previous performances to increase our exposure on social media.
So not by any manner of means sitting on your hands, and there's been opportunities to publicize, been opportunities to go back over archived material and bring that to people's attention. So I suppose that's fine. I think that we will probably all find that the pandemic is even more attritional if it goes on any longer. Obviously, it's grieving to hear what Evelyn says about the situation in South Africa, where I did rather suspect that things have not got as far ahead as they have in the UK in terms of retreat from pandemic, although it does sound like we're picking up in Russia. But what about North Cheshire and South Manchester? How is a large reform community there and its choral resource, and for that matter, its general musical and service resource, coping with the pandemic? Ruti? Well,
speaking for Menorah, I think we've been extremely lucky. So first of all, about 4 or 5 years ago, one of our congregation came and said to me that she was going to America and would not hear the choir in the high holidays, and asked if we could put some songs on the website. So we'd already brought out 2 CDs of the choir, so we immediately put those on the website. And after that, every week rehearsal, we recorded 2 songs just for that purpose. So if you now go to the Menorah website, you will find something like 65 songs from the services already cooked and ready, which we used for our services every Shabbat and the last high holidays. But apart from that, when the pandemic started and we started rehearsing on Zoom, I wrote the choir a song called "We'll Sing You Away" about the pandemic. It was fun. and we sang it, but couldn't hear ourselves singing it together. So I approached my husband, who some of you will know, used to be the principal cellist of the Halle Orchestra for many years, and asked him whether he could do one of these lockdown recordings. And at first he shouted at me, he said, "Don't be stupid, I've never done anything like that in my life." But then he looked into it, and the result is that we have now done 13 lockdown recordings. And the thing is, the choir at first found it very hard, some still do, but we would prepare the master recordings of each part. They will receive it, they will put their earphones on, listen to the master recording and record themselves, which in a way helped to make the choir even better than it was before. Because before you can lean on the people next to you to help you through a difficult passage, here they had to do it all on their own. So really the congregation has been amazingly lucky, and we never stopped.
Fantastic. So we've got choirs that are in a hiatus. We've got choirs that are coming back from hiatus, who've been working assiduously to pass through the pandemic as actively as they can. I think probably what we should now do is to turn to consider really perhaps the strap line for this evening. Remember my two little questions before, and perhaps even the cheekier question, who needs a Shul choir? What I think we want to try and understand to an extent is the way we see the choir as a function of the synagogue. Everybody speaking tonight is involved with the organization of performance choirs, concert choirs, art music choirs, but everybody has also got some association with a choir whose raison d'etre, if I may, whose function, whose very existence is to substantiate the synagogue service where they are based. And the question we're really asking is, do we see a future in this? Are people who are attending synagogues, Orthodox, Reform, it frankly doesn't matter, because people are people and they've got their own ideas of what makes them spiritually uplifted. Are people asking for more choral singing, less choral singing, for the choir not to sing against the congregation but to lead it, for the choir perhaps to be the congregation? I've heard that mentioned by other people in some of our Zoom sessions as well. These are all, I think, interesting issues to consider. I'd like to come to Alan first of all, because it's my understanding with great sorrow that the choir at Raleigh Close, where Alan cut his teeth and where he conducted for many years, is more or less defunct. If I'm wrong with that, Alan, please obviously correct me, but where do you see that as typifying the trajectory for the synagogue choir today?
Well, sadly, I see that as typical. There is a new generation growing up who don't seem to have a taste for that, the large, really the large Shul even. And, you know, I think that's a bit of a problem as well. If you prefer to daven in a small shtibel style atmosphere, you don't really have, that's not really ideally suited for the traditional Chazan choir atmosphere of the large Shul. Insofar as there is still, and there is still, was anyway up to the beginning of COVID, a main service in the large Shul in Hendon, it was increasingly badly attended, and with more older members of the community. The younger members, in common with many other shuls, there's a Hashkoma minyan, there's an alternative parallel minyan, and that's where the younger members tended to gravitate, presumably because that style of more informal participatory service was more to their liking. It's very difficult, unfortunately, for me to see where a shul choir would fit into that, other than on special occasions like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, which hopefully would serve to keep those special occasions special. But to be perfectly honest with Daniel, I don't think there's even a guarantee of that going forward at the moment. I hope I'm wrong.
That's interesting. I mean, obviously, I know a fair amount about that choir, having sung with you in it from time to time over years gone by. and indeed my late father was a member of
Pleasure to have you.
probably even slightly before you were. There's obviously a major tradition there, which is being, well, abrogated, frankly, by a different way of looking at running a service. Now, Ben, how does that play out at Belsize Square? I painted the picture that that was a community founded by Lewandowski lovers who came as refugees from 1930s and 1940s Germany. And obviously that generation has largely passed on by now. Is the demography of Belsize Square changing the demands on the choir? Is it requiring you to look at different music? Is it requiring you at times not to sing when you otherwise would have done?
So lots of important questions there. I'm looking actually at Sue Mariner, who's joined the session, who was director of music for a long time at Belsize, and we were discussing that this morning, the continuation of the Belsize music tradition. I would say, similarly to the Moscow choir, Belsize has an important story that is connected with music. And the Lewandowski scores were sort of brought over by the first cantor of the synagogue, and it formed an important part of kind of the core musical identity of the synagogue. And my sense is that successive generations of synagogue members have kind of absorbed that as part of the synagogue story and part of the liturgy. And there are certainly plenty of people who say they essentially come and sit upstairs at high holidays because they want to be near the choir and they want to listen to it. So I don't think that's dying. There is obviously a shift in the membership of the synagogue, and at the moment I think the desire is to keep the choral tradition pretty much as it has been. I'm not sure how that's going to play out entirely over the next 10 years, 20 years, things of that kind, as we move away from that sort of founding story. But for the moment, I think the Lewandowski identity, a little similarly to the synagogue in Berlin, with whom we've had a lot of partnerships, is a very important part of Belsize's kind of unique identity. And so I don't think there's, you know, we occasionally bring in other music. We do have other pieces. Sue, in fact, has written quite a lot of music for the synagogue, amongst other people. But by and large, we keep to the Lewandowski and occasional Sulzer Mombach liturgy compositions. And there's not a huge pressure at this point to change that.
Interesting. Okay, so that's one little beacon of light, maybe, which doesn't have to drag itself off to the concert hall in order to justify its existence. Although
Certainly not yet.
I've no doubt the talent you have in that choir could take it off to the concert hall, but that's a separate question we'll come to in a minute. Evelyn, what's happening with synagogues in South Africa? And let's, for the purposes of this conversation, assume that we were talking about life in 2019 and before, so pre-pandemic. I imagine that the move to black majority rule and the movement of population affected the size and substance of the Jewish community. We've certainly seen a lot of lovely South Africans popping up to live in the UK over the years. To what extent do you think there is a simple demographic erosion there? To what extent do you think that there is continuity and that synagogues in South Africa are still preaching that message of communal musical continuity? And conversely, to what extent do you feel that is changing?
Well, as you quite rightly mentioned, sadly, there's been a lot of immigration. The big shuls are suffering. And I refer to the big shuls, that is a shul that has a chazan and choir. Mm-hmm. We have, particularly in Johannesburg, a number of shtiblach that have sprung up all over in the suburb of Glenhazel, which is a very Jewish area. I think there are about 20 shtibels within a very, very small radius. Right. So the younger people are tending to want to go to Osamer, Shtibels and Chabatz. They want to go, daven in and out and finished. And consequently, the big shuls that do have a chazan and a choir are actually beginning to suffer very, very badly. I think another influence is financial. To keep a chazan and a choir going all the time is costly. The pandemic has also played an important part. People maybe not, or certainly not going to shul. Then shuls are not recouping money. So I think there are a number of different facets, but I also strongly believe that certainly in Johannesburg, most of the shuls have a younger generation gabbai to what was 20 or 30 years ago, as well as rabbonim. And the younger gabboim today have the feeling that a shul should be run as a business. You start Friday night, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, you finish. Shabbos morning, you start 8:15, 11 o'clock, you got out of there for whatever reason. And they tend to put a lot of pressure on both the chazan and the choir. And it doesn't all go well for the future, I'm afraid. So I hope I don't come over too negative, but this is really what's happening, is that a lot of immigration, the upshoot of a lot of Shtiblach, Chabad shuls, also Me'ach shuls. And so the big shuls are suffering. Some of them are closing down. A lot of the shuls the chazonim are retiring. Whether they're actually retiring of their own volition or whether they've been pushed is another story. Who are they going to take over? Another problem in Johannesburg, of course, is that the young people are not really interested in wanting to join a shul choir. Right. So most of the choristers in the existing choirs that are still functioning when we can sing are middle-aged people and older. The younger generation just don't seem to be interested in wanting to join the choir for whatever reason. I have my own particular feel that a lot stems from the home background, and also the fact that we have a number of Jewish day schools, and I'm afraid they don't introduce music as part of the curriculum.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so the Jewish day schools don't have a choir, a properly trained choir, an orchestra, a recorded band, a jazz band. And so the kids are not growing up with music as part of the curriculum, as part of an education. They've got the privilege of going for private lessons, instrumental lessons, that's great. So it's not what it used to be. Johannesburg was always known as the last bastion of Chazan and choir, but sadly it's not going to happen. It's on its way out, I'm afraid.
I thank you for telling it how it is, because part of the function of these Voice of the Counter sessions is that people should tell it how it is, because if we tell it how it is, then we may understand the problems and perhaps start to see if there are solutions to them. So it's very valuable you've put it that way. I think that it would be sad to the point of tragic if there was a major fall off and demise in the great, as you say, counter choir tradition that South Africa, perhaps punching well above its weight, has provided to the diaspora Jewish world. One can think of many phenomenal chazanim who've come from there, who've gone to work there, and the choirs that they've had, and obviously the Johannesburg Jewish male choir, which we mentioned before, is a male-voiced Jewish force to be reckoned with, and I'd like to think it still will be. But perhaps if I can pass to Sasha here, because here I think we'd like to understand a little bit about how the choir that you have, the male voice choir, has in some respects, as far as I can gather, really become very much a showpiece for the Jewish community. You gave us an introduction to how you brought that choir into existence and whose vision it was and who provided some of the initial funding. And obviously it's a professional choir, which is interesting. So all of your choristers are presumably paid something to sing and to attend. But tell us a little bit about the way that the choir sits within the contemporary Moscow and Russian Jewish community.
I should say that the choir, according to my opinion, is a fantastic instrument to attract people into the synagogue and into the community, because people really like to come and hear and see something very interesting, especially people who are, like we say, semi-secular or not religious deeply. They want to come and hear something what they adapt to hear at the concerts and museums to see, whatever. So exactly what Ralph Goldman used to say many years ago, I think he was absolutely right. Especially here in Russia, you know, the level of culture, the standards was very high, and choir singing was very interesting to people, for the people who you know come to the synagogue. So again, unfortunately, the situation totally depends on rabbis here and leaders of the Jewish organizations. Today we have a situation when the rabbis, and especially president of the Russian Jewish Congress, the Chabad Lubavitch, you know, people from the administration, they don't think that singing and choral singing is so important to support, to support and to put it like as a first preference in our life. They prefer, of course, to attract young people and to give them something which will be more easy to understand and absorb. And they think that the choral singing is not the thing what could be interested them. And I think it is a problem, because they think that young people will come and bring more financial support to the community, because they're young, because they work, because they make money, so they probably will donate to the community. But these people, they think, not value a choral traditions, and it's not interesting for them. I think it is a big mistake, because simultaneously with this choir, I'm conducting, I mentioned already, the Moscow Cantorial Society choir, and I have lots of young singers, people who graduated from the musical schools when they're children, and then they change specialty, they become, engineers, doctors, whatever, but they like to spend time and be somehow on stage, be somehow involved and tied up with music. So it's for them an opportunity to sing, to stay on stage, to have an opportunity to sing with a big symphony professional orchestra, with professional soloists. So I think the same might and should happen in the Jewish communities, but it totally depends on the rabbis and leaders. If they have culture enough and, visual strategy, as we say, for understanding, then they will do the same kind of activity in the synagogues. And the choir is a brilliant instrument to unite people, to bring more audience into the synagogue, into the community. That's my vision, really.
I mean, I agree with all of that. I'll mention something here in passing. The Zamir Chorale Foundation in New York, in America, about 10, 12 years ago, conducted some research into social trends affecting people who sing in choirs, or social trends influenced by people who sing in choirs. And it was very interesting. I mean, there you are talking about America. Other countries may have slightly different takes on this, but I don't think so, because I think actually we know what values, generally speaking, are espoused by people who like singing in groups. And they found, for example, that if you sing in a choir, not a Jewish choir, any choir, if you sing in a choir, you're much more likely, for example, to have children who've got good educational values, or you're much more likely to be a modest or even a significant contributor to charity. In other words, it says something about you as an individual that you want to sing in a choir, that you want to associate with choral singing for everything it brings. And as I stress, that's not a Jewish thing, it's a choral thing, because this isn't something that just affects Jews. I think there is something which is particularly socially cohesive and stimulant about singing in a group of voices together and working out how your part fits in and enjoying the experience. And I think what Sasha has basically said is there are some people, sadly, some people in positions of finance and organization who don't get that point. And
yes, I should say even more. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Yes, because we are a professional choir, and I always were looking for sponsors who will help us to rehearse and prepare a good, really high standard product, which we can bring to Europe and show as a unique achievement from Russia, where we have a very big, very high choral traditions and the classical traditions. So we approach here to the same donors, to the same people who donate money to the Jewish community. And we are, it's very bad to say, but we are in a competition with the Jewish community. So choir and Jewish community separately are trying to approach to the same people and ask for money. They are for the community, we are also for the community, but for the choir. So we are in competition with them, and they are trying to, to push us out, yes. Which is, I think, completely wrong.
We need a strategy for this, which perhaps we might even discuss or take some questions on later. I'd like perhaps now to get a little more granular, if I may, and actually discuss perhaps this perception that people have that the choir, maybe even more than the cantor, is somehow an obstruction to enjoyment of the contemporary synagogue service. People may not want to listen to the repertoire the choir sings. They may not identify with that era of music anymore. People may feel, as has already been said by one or two of our panelists, that there is simply not time enough on a Shabbat morning for the choir to indulge because everybody's got their timetable and you can't prolong the service. Let me now turn that question on its head. Do we think, and I don't mind how you choose to answer this, but do we think that the counter argument there is, yes, the choir is needed, because yes, the choir will show the congregation how to sing tunes, how to listen to tunes, how to hear what they're supposed to join in with? Or do we still think we're going to face people saying that the choir is competing with the synagogue? Now, Alan's already said something about this in the context of the disappearance of the choir from the main community service at Hendon Raleigh Close. I'd like to ask Ruti perhaps to take that question first, because obviously, to an extent, I think musical performance in the Reform is a little less hidebound, it's a little more freeform. You may have a bit more latitude to what you can do. But do you feel that you can plead the case in Menorah, and maybe this typifies the Reform movement generally, for saying, yes, we need the choir because the choir leads, it doesn't obstruct?
Well, let me first of all say somebody wrote a question and they were asking where they can hear all these recordings. So all you have to do is go to your search engine and write Menorah Synagogue. That's M-E-N-O-R-A-H. And you'll get straight in there. And one of the drop-down menus is choir. And you will have an absolute treasure there. All the holidays, you've got 12 or 13, I can't remember, versions of Adon Olam, and you've got the fantastic concert that we had, an international concert with instrumentalists and choirs from all over the world last January. Now, having heard all this, I'm almost embarrassed to say that the choir at Menorah is riding high. I mean, that's not to say that I've not had difficulties, never with the choir, and never with the congregation. I don't come well, I do now. When we are on Zoom, I'm there every Shabbat. But normally I don't. I come when I'm requested, when people ask the choir to come and sing for certain, and they ask a lot. Every bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, whatever, they want the choir there. If I come to the synagogue and they see me in the car park, they say, oh, great, the choir is here today. We had a rabbi, a young guy known for a fantastic sense of humor, who used to say, everybody, 95% of the congregation come for the choir and 5% come for me. That was Chaim Shalom. It's funny, but there's something in it. So I really feel sorry for the people who don't, and I have to point out that the choir is completely amateur. The only professional musician in the choir is my husband, like I said, and he's a cellist, not a professional singer. Happens to be a beautiful tenor, but that's beside the point. But they are all amateurs, and I tell you, apart from 4, I think, they don't read music. And yet they are a fabulous choir. And I think they're supported by the majority of the congregation. I mean, I did have at times questions like, do you have to give the choir a note because it stops the fluency of the service? Can you not just start them without giving them a note? That sort of thing. But we managed to struggle and win comments like that. So maybe I can't offer much.
I've sung in occasional synagogue choirs where the conductor's given them a note and hasn't done a damn bit of good because they're still sung something different anyway. But, we have that issue. I think we'll call that a matter of technical presentation. And I do take your point there. Some people don't understand why you have to actually fashion the piece and start it off and so on. And it doesn't start by itself. So that's neither here nor there, really.
Well, something interesting about the singing together with the choir. Normally we are there, and I think I can see them singing with us. Now we have begun a half services. Some people, very few people are in the congregation in person, and the rest of us are on Zoom. And there was a comment that somebody said, please, can you not play the recordings of the choir because we are not allowed to sing with them? So they actually objected to the fact that the choir was playing and they couldn't sing with them. needless to say, we're not taking much notice of that kind of a comment.
Can't please all sorts, can you?
Yep.
I recall an occasion, we were on a family holiday for Pesach in Jerusalem, and my father and I went to the great synagogue in central Jerusalem to listen to Naftali Hershtik, who was, of course, then the chazan there, and Raymond Goldstein and Eli Yaffe running the choir. And it was very much theatrical performance. Now, I don't go for that. If I know the tunes, I'm going to sing. And my dad was exactly the same. And so there we are standing in the congregation, about the only people joining in. And some old codger comes up to us and says to us, Aslama lo tashiritam, pointing to the choir. In Hebrew, I've just said, so why don't you go and join them and sing with them? To which we said, well, we are, you know, thank you all the same. That's exactly what we're doing. It's not our fault if we know what the choir is singing and the rest of the congregation doesn't. Now, to what extent, this is a model in Jerusalem where the vast majority of people attending go there to be sung at. And they're very happy with that. Do we think that that model, generally speaking, has any viability? Ben, I mean, obviously, of course, if you're doing the Lewandowski thing in Belsize Square, and it is arguable that some of the congregation are not as tuned into that as older members would have been, is it very much a choir that performs to the congregation, or does the congregation feel that it is as one with the choir and is being led and helped to sing with them?
I'd say actually it's a mixture of different things. I don't think there are people who strongly say we don't like having the choir, it prevents us from singing along. Very occasionally I get that comment about the organ, not about the choir. In general, interestingly, Lewandowski specifically wrote his music so it could be singable, and he intended for it to be sung by people who were not just in a choir. And so, in fact, the congregation sings along with the choir very easily. So it's not as much of a difficulty as you might think. I don't always hear them, except when it's high holidays and the synagogue is completely full. And then, trust me, you hear the entire congregation singing along very loudly. So I don't think it's not a problem in that sense. I would say there is probably a greater sort of warmth in some way when either the community choir or in particular the youth choir is singing. So you get a lot of sort of positive responses because obviously people love to see the young people singing from the community point of view, but there's not a sense that the existence of a choir, professional or otherwise, is hindering the musical participation of people in services. And I would add that's probably because in truth, Lewandowski wrote really good music. Yes, so they actually really like the stuff and they like singing along to it.
I'd agree with all of that. Sasha, is it the same for you in Moscow? Do you find that your choir, when it is in the synagogue, not on the concert stage, obviously that's performing there, but when it's in the synagogue, is it really performing to the congregation, or is it?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have a genre here, the cantorial concert, the liturgical concert inside of synagogue. During the service, when the choir is singing, sometimes, which is actually crazy, people start to applaud us. With the finish. Yeah, and it's very, very, nerving the rabbis and people, who are in charge of the liturgical service, especially in the Orthodox synagogues, in the Chabad synagogues. But in the Chabad, they all like to participate. It's like interactive show. They are singing together, they are dancing around the, around Kodesh together with choir. We are, working around with them and singing.
We have discussed in the context of several of the other panel sessions, which, as I said before, have mostly concerned cantors and cantorial performance. We've discussed a phenomenon which I prefer to use the word, I prefer to call concertization. It's a coinage of my own, it'll do for tonight, you may have a better one. By what I mean by that is that it is regarded as useful to the point of being necessary or obligatory, that music from the tradition that cannot be sung in the synagogue is expelled from the synagogue onto the concert stage, if I may put it that way. Now, we've all come over the last few years to accommodate the idea of the cantorial concert. And some of these concerts have become more and more and more elaborate, with choirs backing them and symphony orchestras and you name it, Sonia Lumiere, all sorts of phenomena. So the cantorial concert has really taken off as a genre. And some chazanim live for the idea of being able to perform on stage what they absolutely no longer can perform in the synagogue. Do we see that as being the salvation for a pretty vast repertoire of very competently composed 19th and 20th century cantorial and cantorial choral music? Or if we say that we're going to project this onto the stage, are we in a sense retreating? Are we in a sense denying that this was actually music that was written to be sung to people in synagogue for the purposes of inspiring their prayer and inspiring their devotion? Because I don't think the cantorial concert is devotional. Whatever else it is, I don't think it serves that function. And the choral concert probably similarly. Alan, perhaps I could come to you first on that. We've established, obviously, that sadly the choir at Raleigh Close has not quite fizzled out, but as good as. But you have the London Cantorial Singers, which has established a solid reputation for taking that sort of music to the concert stage. Do you think that that's the way ahead? We can't save the choir in the Shul, so therefore, for goodness sake, let's have cantorial concerts and choral concerts to save the music there.
Well, if we can't save the music in the Shul, in a Shul atmosphere, and I'll come back to that in a minute if I may, then it is my passionate wish that it should be preserved and it shouldn't be lost, because you know, so many of the pieces are so beautiful and so uplifting spiritually and aesthetically and intellectually and everything else, that there should be an outlet for it. There should be, and there still is, a demand for it in another setting outside the Shul. And insofar as there is that demand for it, you know, the London Cantorial Singers exist to fulfill that, but not exclusively in the concert hall. We are in demand to some extent for our performances in special services.
Oh,
we have, up to COVID, been proud to do an annual Tsaliuk service for upwards of 20 years. And we've never missed one. There's always been a demand for it. Our services are in demand for other special occasions like Shul anniversaries, rabbinical inductions, Holocaust memorial, and these present their own opportunities for carefully selected pieces. Insofar as there is, I'm not writing off the idea that there is no future for some of these great pieces within a Shul service. I think that there is much to be said for the dimension that they, for some people, not everyone, unfortunately, but for some people, they will be spiritually moved by this music and brought closer to Hashem in the prayer experience. Mm-hmm. On a personal level, that is certainly true, and I know that I'm not alone.
No, you're not.
What will be interesting in the years and decades ahead is whether future generations will relate to the music as a means of enhancing their prayer relationship with Hashem, and who knows, time will tell.
So, in summary, we've got a sense there that there must still be a function for choral singing of some sort in the Shul, and I guess that the function will change or develop with time, but that to say that it will be swept away completely, unlikely. And so long as we can keep a lot of this music in live circulation in recordings and on the concert stage, then we're being at least a little true to ourselves, so that the concertization idea is not the death knell of the synagogue choir. It may just be an evolution of that into a next choral iteration, if you like.
Very well put, Daniel.
Okay, thank you. Sasha, do you agree? We're talking here about the fact that there may be no personnel distinction between your male voice choir and the choir that sings in the synagogue. And you've already established that the choir that sings in the synagogue is, in a sense, performing much as it would do on the stage. And there is still an acceptability for that, it seems, perhaps less so from rabbis and communal organizers, and sadly a bit less so from people with money, but perhaps the ordinary people who come to the synagogue services in Moscow are still enjoying that sound and still want to hear it and still want to think it's part of what they go for to be uplifted.
Daniel, you're absolutely right. We had a project a couple of years ago. We call it lecture concerts about Jewish liturgical and folk music. So we have a narrator, a musicologist, professional from the conservatory, who spoke from stage about music, what we are singing, and we illustrated that music. And believe me, it was not only Jewish people in the hall, but a lot of, regular people who love classical music. And it was such a huge, high interest to these programs. And I think that the situation of singing in the synagogue totally depend on the rabbis and, big guys from the Jewish communities, like here, like the Russian Jewish Congress or Federation of Jewish Communities of Russia. If they have a secular education, which, help them to understand how important is culture and how important is influence of culture to the people who are coming to the community, who are coming to the synagogue, then these choral traditions and cantorial traditions and the chazonist traditions will be popularized and will continue to live.
Hmm. Good.
It totally depends on people who are sitting and who have not only money, but also a little bit of seichel.
I like your lecture concerts. You're not the only people who've done that, because we had a go at those in London in the 1980s as well. As Ben and Alan will both bear out, my father was involved in several such for the Sulzer and Lewandowski anniversaries, for Kristallnacht, and there were one or two others that were produced as well, to use music and surround it with a certain amount of commentary, so that it's not just simply unknown music sung by a choir at you. You bring it alive by offering a certain amount of explanation. One of the things I was discussing in email exchange with Charlie Heller, who appeared on last week's panel on Nusach, was the idea that we need to get a little bit more gentle explanation of the music as distinct from the text into the congregational service. Not so much that people think they've come for an academic study, but enough that they feel that there's something unusual, something from their past, something from their community past, something from Jewish history that is tangible, that you can use to explain to them what this is doing there and why it's important and why it should prick their conscience. And it's very interesting to hear that that is already a model that you're looking at as well. And, Yasher Kochecha, I think that's very important. Evelyn, what about South Africa? How do we see that balance working out?
Well, I would just like to mention that when the Johannesburg Jewish Male Choir was formed in 1986, we used to have 2 concerts at the Linde Auditorium. The capacity of the Linde is 1,068 seats. So we used to have over 2,000 people coming to a concert. And this pattern continued right up until, I would say, the end of 1990, 1999, 2000. The mission statement of the JJMC was to preserve and maintain Jewish music in all its forms, chazanot, Yiddish, and contemporary. As time has gone by, I suppose again maybe due to immigration and to what is going on in the shuls, and it really saddens me from sitting here in South Africa when I think that one talks about congregational singing. Yes, some of the shuls do introduce Karlebach. The conductors actually stand and indicate to the congregation to sing, and they sit there, they don't even bother to participate. The repertoire has changed. I mean, they would love to do Lewandowski, they do Lewandowski, they do Rosenblatt, Mambach, Rumshinsky, whatever it is. But, the famous phrase, "Das ist what die Public will." They've even resorted at times to introducing music from the musicals. And as I mentioned in a webinar that I did 2 weeks ago with Russell Lurie, that late Chief Rabbi Harris actually put in his book, he didn't know that Andrew Lloyd Webber had written for the Shul. I mean, this is the way it's going now. It's the way it's going down now, that to try and attract people to enjoy a chazan and a choir, one is actually playing down. In terms of the concert stage now, we have had to change our repertoire drastically because we get the phrase, oh, the music is too heavy, it's too boring, in spite of the fact that there's a huge variety of repertoire, some chazanut, some Yiddish, some Hasidic music. This is what the public will. They want to come to the concert to hear what they know. So it pains me, it really and truly pains me that the whole demographics of Jewish music in South Africa has changed so vastly. Even at chuppahs, we would always do a chuppah with a chazan and a choir and do a beautiful traditional service, beautifully sung, chazan, choir, and organ. Today, the chazan is pushed out. There are no more choirs. They have a band and a bass guitar, an electric guitar, and a keyboard. And I don't want to comment on the standard of performance, but it's going downhill very, very rapidly. And it really saddens me very, very much, because I don't know how, and if possible, South Africa could ever come back to the way it was 10, 15, 20 years ago.
I think we'll allow you to comment on the standard of other keyboard players. I think that's legitimate, given your calling. No, I understand that. It's depressing in a sense, because that was a community that thoroughly believed in this as a model. And instead of evolving the model, they want to abrogate quite a lot of it. And that's a shame. I don't know whether or not anybody's got an instant cure for that. So
Daniel, I have something to say. A couple of years ago, because I'm conducting this Moscow oratorio, and they used to sing every Christmas concert Messiah, Handel. I offered to sing together Jewish male voice choir, the Moscow Male Jewish Capella, plus to Moscow Oratorio, Judah Maccabeus by Handel. Right. And we performed here, we found a sponsor, we performed here with a big symphony orchestra, a full oratorio in English language, 3 hours almost. Oof. It was a full hall, it was a tremendous success, and it was a totally Jewish subject. Joseph Malavani came here, we sang all of the prayers before beginning of the oratorio, and people were absolutely, standing ovation. So everything depends on music, on quality of music. Doesn't matter, new one, contemporary, old. Yeah. There are two kinds of music exist, bad and good. So the good music will also survive. That's, I totally, it depends on people who are behind. If they want to educate community, if they want to make it popular, they will support, they will do whatever they can to move it ahead. If not, it's impossible.
It's 8:25 in London, and it's a bit later than that for some of our other participants. I'm going to suggest perhaps that we now see what questions have come up in the chat. I have to confess I've not been watching it because I've been thinking about what I'm doing here, but Hirsch has been moderating and monitoring, I should say, the chat. And Hirsch, perhaps you can tell us if anybody's got questions that they'd like to throw at the panel, and perhaps you can unmute them.
Well, you could do that, or I could simply raise the questions, because there's two questions here which both relate to each other, both for Sasha. There's Jeanette Copperman says she would like to hear more about the story of the Moscow Choir. How did they get people involved in it? And Rosemary Abrams is asking the question, are the Moscow choristers all Jewish? So maybe Sasha would like to answer those questions.
Yes, quickly, of course, I can tell you. First of all, we have, of course, a very mixture staff in the choir. I have Jews, I have Russians, I have Armenian, I have Georgians, I have some Ukrainians, maybe one guy even from Kazakhstan. So, and these people, they so much like this Jewish music, what we perform. People say that Russians are very anti-Semitic and very aggressive against the Jewish stuff. It's absolutely incorrect. Intelligent people of all nations are so much like the Jewish music, and audience who come to our concerts, non-Jewish audience, they are crazy about Jewish music. They like it because we had a renaissance of the Russian Orthodox Church music. But people wanted to hear Jewish liturgical music as a beginning for the Russian Orthodox Church music, because the Gregorian, the early music came from the Jewish music. So
Yes.
they wanted to know roots. And it's very, very popular among non-Jewish audience here. They like it. They could understand nothing, you know, about the text, about the meaning, but they love this Hazanut, traditional classical Hazanut. Even the professors from the Moscow Tchaikovsky Conservatory, they come to the concerts and they are listening like this.
Okay, so there's Alex Klein has asked various questions, but I think the one that maybe we should start with, and then Alex has raised his hand, so he might want to ask a bit more or elaborate further. He's really asking the question, does the panel think those who run the shuls are making the wrong choice and that they should employ a choir in their shuls? You can choose who should answer that, Daniel.
Well, I think Alan should have the first go at that one, because I think of all the people speaking tonight, he's probably the greatest victim there, if I may. What do you reckon, Alan?
Well, it was of 30 years that I was appointed choir master at Hendon Shul, and I have to be thankful that by and large I've had good working relations with the Shul management, in particular with the wardens of the main service to whom I report. But I think the reason for that is relatively simple. The wardens, certainly of the main service, are there to represent the congregation that they are wardens of. And if, you know, if they, I'm sure that during the service when the choir was performing, they could gauge what the general reaction was. Maybe people were making comments, good or bad. I have to say on a personal level that after certain services, be it Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, festivals, I was lucky that certain people would come up to me and say, oh, choir was good today, I really enjoyed it. But I can't really remember anyone coming up to me and saying to my face, choir was awful today. Why did you sing this? Why did you sing that? Or negative feedback. But I knew that negative feedback was going on. It just wasn't being directed at me. It was probably being directed at the wardens, because I was, you know, any negative feedback I would get through them. So in a roundabout way, what I'm coming round to saying is, the wardens historically were acting as they should, as representatives of the congregation who were attending the service. And for the vast majority of the time, in that capacity, they were supportive of the choir. Whatever their personal views as to whether they liked the choir or not, they subordinated those to their position of responsibility, which I think is as it should be in a shul. Right now, I wouldn't be surprised if the powers that be in the shul are similarly representing the views of the wider community, insofar as does the wider community in the shul as a whole want a Chazan and choir service to continue? Of course, without taking a straw poll, which I don't think is going to happen, it's very difficult. You just, I guess, if you're in that position, you gain a feel for what is wanted. I would be very sad to be working with any shul management seeking to impose a personal agenda in that respect. But I'm thankful and happy to say that that has never been my experience.
Evelyn, what do you think about that?
It's a very difficult one. It's really very difficult. I agree that the Gaboim and the Rabbonim, that everybody should work as one happy family. I would just like to mention, just a little issue, that in some of the JGMC concerts that we've done in the past, we collaborated with a black choir. The musical called the Imalonji Country Choral Society, and the conductor, George Maxadana, just absolutely fell in love with Jewish music. He was actually invited to a shul on a Friday night, came to a Friday night Shabbat service, and came to Friends for Shabbat dinner, and just fell in love with the Lewandowski Tzadik HaShaman. And every concert that he does with his choir, he has been putting in some Jewish music. And now it is so interesting that Alex said that in Russia, some of the people are non-Jewish. At our JJMC concerts, I know a lot of my pupils are not Jewish. The parents have come. We've had a lot of non-Jewish people come to the concert and they love the music. George and his black choir love the Jewish music. What's wrong with our Jewish people? Why isn't it good enough for them anymore?
Can I come back on that, Hirsch? Because you said I might have something to say. The problem I see today is we have there are no professional chazonim full-time in London who can work with a choir. So in the old days, during the week, the chazan used to sing with the choir, rehearse with the choir. So when it came to the services using the Minhag Anglia and the Blue Book, the congregants and everyone was familiar with the music that was sung and used to join in. So it wasn't a passive service. Today we have no chazonim to lead the services, and those that are part-time professionals and not chazonim cannot read music, do not understand the music, cannot work with a choir, and therefore what comes out is amateurish, boring stuff. And because of this, the people in the community or in the congregations think that's what they are hearing is a traditional, good chazonus and choral music, which it is completely not, and that is killing the reason why those that are in charge are saying, sorry, we want to finish at 12 o'clock, and I don't blame them with the standards.
Alan,
there's no such thing as amateur. If you sing in front of an audience, whether you get paid or not, you have to have the right standard in order to sing. If you haven't got that standard, don't sing. But if we teach our children and make it compulsory in Jewish day schools to teach our beautiful liturgy, we have a chance. If it's not compulsory, we have no chance whatsoever. And somebody brought up the Zamir Choral Youth Choir, which is fantastically successful. And if people say that you do not want to sing our liturgy, they've got it completely wrong, because hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids all over America and Israel belong to the Youth Zamir or the Youth Choral Zamir Choir, and everybody wants to get into it, and there's waiting lists for kids and teenagers to get into the choir. So that is a load of poppycock, I'm sorry. And Robert Keevel, who's here, and a few others will verify that to be correct. So Alex, maybe ask Robert and he will tell you.
Alex, can I hold you there? A lot of that is fine. Ironically, insofar as getting the congregation to sing, as distinct from feeling good about the shul atmosphere, ironically, a choir on its own, even without a fundamentally good cantor, can achieve a lot. Because a lot of singing is congregational type songs. We heard from Ben before that Lewandowski wrote music that it was intended for the congregation to empathize with. Not a lot of Lewandowski is cantorial in its basis. There is some, but we've got a situation here where maybe, and I'd care to hear from some of the panelists on this, maybe the choir is the way back for helping people in the congregation to plug into spiritual music. If they don't want to listen to a paid professional cantor, caterwauling, if I may, maybe they'll listen to a good choir leading by example and giving them music that they can learn and imitate. And that isn't necessarily a demerit for the fact that there isn't a cantorial tradition to talk of in the UK anymore, not a professional one. Ben, can you have a go at that? I mean, I think we're talking about the Belsize Square model, are we not? Where, generally speaking, there is a good resonance for the congregation with the choir, and those that want to sing with them certainly do, and they don't feel shouted out. Is that a fair comment?
I think that sort of is. I mean, I should add, we do have a professional cantor and we do work with him, and he's here at this session, Paul Heller. So we are an exception now with respect to other synagogues. Obviously, you can't force a congregation to have a choir. So there's a risk of sitting here as sort of slightly older people tut-tutting and complaining that people don't like choirs anymore. But the possibilities of a choir being a sort of leader for the congregation still exist. The possibilities of younger people absorbing and enjoying the music still exist. So the Belsize Youth Choir certainly does learn the Lewandowski liturgy, and it takes that on its, you know, they absorb that as the music of their synagogue, and that's what they think of nostalgically, I think, when they think of synagogue services. So from that point of view, I'm not sure whether I'm completely answering the question here. There are certainly ways of having a choral tradition that doesn't get just jettisoned by the synagogue. But synagogues are very different. And I do think that question of standards of performance, which has been coming up in the chat, is quite important. You don't want to have a choir that is sort of tolerated. You do want to have a choir that people genuinely want to listen to and want to have as part of your services. They're either excited to be part of the choir, or they're at least excited enough to listen to the choir and to sing along with it and recognize that brings something that is not brought just by having everybody singing along. And that's not necessarily something that is easily done, and it does require support from the synagogue management and the synagogue in general. I guess I'm lucky enough to be in a synagogue where that is an important part of the identity of the synagogue, and the board takes it seriously. I'm not certain how you create that in all synagogues, or whether you can or should. I hope that's a half answer to something.
No, it's a very good answer. Thank you. Ruti, do you feel the same way with respect to what you've achieved at Menorah? I mean, we've got a situation which you've described as being 95% favouring the choir and 5% for the rabbi, which was...
Yeah, that was a bit of a joke, yeah.
That's a flippant remark, but at all events, it does say something about the rabbi's perception of what people are coming to the service for.
Well, first of all, I have to argue with Ben about something. The quote that I know about Lewandowski is that he deliberately wrote quite difficult music for the choir so that the congregation does not join in. That's what I know. However, we sing everything. We sing Lewandowski. I brought in a lot of modern Israeli tune, as well as my own. I've written well over 20 songs for the choir. And in fact, the synagogue, just to show you the appreciation, they are bringing out a book called Shirat Menorah, which is the songs I've written for the choir. If I may suggest, one of the things we do, which helps us to be more involved in current life, is for the last 7 years, we've had a yearly concert called Choral Extravaganza, which is a multi-faith concert. We have invited every year 3 more choirs from all sorts, Muslims, Christians, Jewish, others Jewish as well, Hindus, Hungarian, I think I'm forgetting someone along the way. And each choir sings about 20 minutes, and then we all get together and we do a sing-along, and we use a song each from every language that the other choirs used. So we teach the audience in the sing-along also the songs from the other beliefs and the other, and these concerts are absolutely not a ticket to be had. They're very popular. This last year, because we couldn't do a concert properly at Menorah, instead of that, we did a Zoom concert, international one, and we had something like 600 more people from all over the world. We had instrumentalists, we had singers from all over, we had people who used to be in our choir joined in. So I think making it relevant, and my singers will tell you, I don't give in on quality. They have to be the best. We are aiming at a professional sound. Nothing else would please me. But at the same time, if you try to be relevant and try and cope with the things that are happening around you in the community, I think that would help.
Well, I served a congregation which was originally in downtown Washington, D.C., and they moved out to the suburbs. The congregation had a semi-professional choir for 70, 80 years, male and boys. And when I came there, the year that I came there, they changed over to a mixed choir. But it was a rough time. There were some people that liked it, some people didn't want it. And we had, for the high holidays, we had multiple services because we had about 1,300 families, and they had giant services. We had 3,500 people davening on the premises. So the people who didn't want the choir went to the other services, but they wanted to hear me daven. So they said, would you come and daven in the other service on the second day of Rosh Hashanah? I said, certainly, but the choir comes with me. That was the end of the discussion. They didn't want the choir. I retired 20 years ago. The year that I retired, the year after I retired, they had a quartet for the high holidays in a sanctuary that sat 1,800. It was a disaster. And since then, they have not had a choir for Shabbat, Shalosh Regalim, or the high holidays. Because the people that wanted the choir died off, and that was the end of it. The people that did not want the choir won out. And now, of course, the Shul, which was very right-wing conservative, it had been Orthodox until the mid-50s, and my predecessor was a Satmar Chassid. So what happened was that when I retired, they forced me to retire, and they forced the choir to retire, and that was the end of it. So now there is an enormous choral repertoire that lays on the shelves as an atavistic thing that did occur there. So for 80 years they had a choir, and then that was the end of it.
Can I ask a further question? Do you think, do the panelists think that by using the Zamir choral model in Europe or in the UK, it would work, and that schools, and the second question, should it be compulsory for Jewish schools to teach liturgy or choral liturgy as part of the music curriculum?
Before you
in order to preserve it and to make it interesting.
In order to just to be clear there, Alex is referring to the Hazamir Youth Choir, not the Zamir Chorale Foundation per se, the Hazamir Youth Choir, which has got probably about 35 chapters across America and about a half a dozen in Israel. They all learn the same repertoire, which does mean it's a rather regimented existence. And they do meet for concerts and conventions, and you can get 300-400 of them on stage at big concert halls. And otherwise, obviously, it's local learning. It requires an enormous amount of volunteer supervision by people who are music professionals who, generally speaking, get their expenses paid, but they don't make an income. It therefore requires an enormous feat of organization. It's got to be that big over about close to 30 years it's taken to get to this level. It is a very high standard of singing. It does generate very well motivated youth, and they go on and sing in other choirs as adults and later in life, and some of them become music professionals, the vast majority do not. And it is a phenomenally cohesive musical experience. It is also, in order to do that, rather regimented, and it has a fixed repertoire. There's not much discretion there. It sits outside the school system in the United States. It's rehearsed separately from that, and it would probably have to do so in the UK as well. Sorry, that's just my little bit of explanation to be quite clear on the point.
At Daniel, they sing, not only do they sing the traditional stuff, they sing also modern pieces which have been written specifically for the choir. So they premiere modern, up to the minute pieces.
I've heard them live in concert 15 times. I know this. The simple point is, I just wanted to explain the background because it's not as straightforward a model to emulate as you might think. I mean, Ben, you've got a youth choir at Belsize Square. What do you think about that?
Tricky. I also see Sue's got her hand waiting to ask a question. I have occasionally thought about the Zamir model, and this is becoming very UK-centric. I'm sorry, because we actually have people from all over the place. My general view so far, well, when I've thought about it, is that the UK just doesn't have the size of Jewish population that makes something like the Zamir youth movement easily possible. And also the Zamir is very based on the American model of having sponsors, seeking sponsorship, that whole kind of foundation model that is still actually not so much part of British culture, which sounds really negative. I think it would be a wonderful idea if it could be made to happen, but I think it is harder here than it is in the US for particularly those two reasons.
Yes.
But I don't want to be a naysayer. If you think it could be done, I think it would be wonderful.
Well, let's not make it British centric. Let's ask let's ask Sasha in Moscow. Do we think that there is a
It could happen in Israel. It can happen anywhere.
well, the Israelis are highly dependent on injection of American capital there. Believe me, they don't raise their own money for this. Sue.
Ben succeeded me as director of music, and what I would say was that we worked incredibly hard in order to maintain our music. We fought sometimes, and it is now, Belsize Square is now known, it's famous for its music, its repertoire. We have an excellent choir, obviously an excellent choir master, but the quality is important to the synagogue. And the youth choir, which they're going through a hard time now because of the pandemic, but the children had to learn the same repertoire as what's sung in the synagogue. So the children have become accustomed to what you would call Lewandowski classical. That's what they know. And just by a side comment, we attend from time to time a united synagogue who don't have a choir. And it's very sort of, everybody sort of sings together. They sing they sing a few classical pieces. And so for one Shabbat Shira, one year, we brought a choir, a male choir, and they augmented the service, and everybody loved it. Now, I don't know if it was nostalgia, and they probably wouldn't want it every week, but it really enhanced their spirituality.
It's very good to hear. Thank you for bringing that to the general attention, because that's very important. So the Belsize Square model, and we've heard it from two musical directors in succession, and I'm quite sure Ruti would agree as well, is solidly, safely preserved, because you can still enthuse the youth of Belsize Square, who are the great-grandchildren, as it were, of the foundation of that community, into identifying with the core values in musical terms that community was effectively set up to maintain. And that's very attractive. Sasha has said something a little similar about the Moscow tradition, although obviously in his case there was a hiatus of 80 years and they found the music with wax seals on it in the KGB archives, which is a fantastic story in itself. But in a sense, it's also a recovery of a musical asset that community has learnt to treasure. I have a feeling that in contradistinction, in a lot of middle-of-the-road Orthodox synagogues in London, and Alan will typify this thoroughly close to an extent, we've got a diffusion of people's interests. The big minyan has broken up into 4 or 5 components. Many of those are not interested in the choral traditions. They're not interested in chazanut, and we have to accept that and work with it and perhaps try and save it elsewhere, which is why perhaps the concert stage is a salvation. The concert stage is a place to take this music. And if the Jews don't want to listen, it sounds like the Goyim, from Christians and Muslims in Manchester to Black Africans in Johannesburg, are very happy to come along and listen. Sorry, I'm just picking these things up from what people have said. I think that there is a great future in choral singing generally because it has such a great social cohesiveness to it. It gives you such a lift to participate in group singing. It's like nothing else anybody knows from that social point of view. I mean, maybe playing in a soccer team is like that, and that I don't pretend to understand. But in terms of artistic music, amateur singing in choir is absolutely mind-manglingly phenomenal. Well, this probably ranks as one of our longest individual VOC sessions. My watch says 7 minutes to 9. It's past Sasha's bedtime, I think. No, he'll probably say not. Do any of our panelists want to say anything final before we wrap this up?
I want to say that when the borders, God bless, will be opened and we could travel, then I'm ready anytime to come with my Moscow Male Jewish Choir to you and perform a fantastic concert.
I think
with our cantors or with your cantors.
Alex, I think we can agree amongst present company that you're more than welcome. What would you say? Evelyn, are the Johannesburg Jewish Male Choir going to tour again anytime soon?
Would love to. Would love to. What is against us, of course, is the exchange rate, but it'd be wonderful if we could combine with the Moscow Synagogue Choir. I mean, we'll just come and do another tour, but please God, the rand-dollar exchange will improve. Who knows if it will, but we can just keep at trying and hope so, because we would really love to tour again.
The ruble isn't looking so clever either. Maybe you go to Russia and you're both working off slightly devalued currencies. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
because of the cold weather.
We're not into currency speculation here. That's not the reason.
No, not yet.
But I mean, yes, I think it's time to have a real burst of enthusiasm and get these choirs moving again. And those that are used to concertizing and touring, please, 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 let's make a note. We've got to have them on concert stage, share gigs with them, bring them over, go and join them, that sort of thing. Ben will no doubt say the same for the Zemel Choir and for Belsize Square and anything else he happens to be conducting.
Can I say that Ben has made most wonderful European choir festivals where he's had choirs from Paris, from Rome. You say, Ben, where your choir has come from.
I'll tell you what, for swiftness, here you go. Here's a link for anybody who wants to watch the thing we did on Zoom. Well, actually, we did a YouTube video with the choirs from Paris and Vienna and Lviv and so forth. So feel free to watch that. Yeah, I think I just echo everything. I want to say thank you to everybody who's put messages in chat, which we haven't managed to really talk about carefully. There's a really interesting sort of global picture, a very varied global picture of some places where there seem to be very active synagogues with choirs and some places where it's really sad that they've disappeared. And that's a very difficult thing to balance if we're talking about synagogue choirs everywhere.
Mm. So I think if I may wrap this up briefly, because time is marching on, who needs a Shul choir? I think in simple terms, we all do, but perhaps for a variety of different reasons. It may not be the same social need or demographic that the Sulzers and the Lewandowskis of this world serviced in the 19th century. It may not even be the sort of post-war revival type Jewish music choirs that we saw in the UK, but we need Shul music to be preserved. Shul music from the last 2 centuries has included cantorial choral and pure choral music. There's books and books and books of the stuff, as we well know. And for anybody whose Shul choir has shut up shop and the files are sitting in some basement or archive somewhere, get them out and at least give them over to people who know how to use them. I don't know whether Robert Keeble has got the chance to retrieve the position from where he officiated, but if he has, no doubt he would. And that
I do have all of those things, and the Cantors Assembly is now funding a project.
Good for you.
UCLA to digitize my whole manuscript collection.
Good for you, sir. More power to you and to them as well. I think that's very valuable. It doesn't matter how contextually useful it is. It doesn't matter whether it's as good as Lewandowski is, and frankly, this is not a comparison exercise. It matters that a tradition is not lost to somebody's attic. It matters that that sort of thing survives and that there's a record of what was there. Who needs a Shul choir? Just to finish those thoughts, I think everybody needs to know that choral singing is safe and that choral singing will continue, and that the Jews attach value to the music that was written for their tradition over several generations. If it has to come through concert performances rather than everyday Shabbat services, A, that's better than nothing, and B, it's very good anyway. We need to get the choir movement moving again as the pandemic recedes, and we hope it recedes, of course. We hope we don't have third waves in Europe, and we hope that people will be able to travel and sing to each other again before long.
On behalf of the European Cantors Association, I would like to just finish up and say thank you, Daniel, for being the moderator. Thank you to all the panelists for a fabulous job, and thank you for everybody for coming and supporting us. And please God, we will see you in 2 weeks' time for our next session.
We're going to have a session with a number of cantors from different countries who perhaps are Eastern European countries, and they'll be telling about their experiences. I think it'll be a very interesting session, so do come and join.
2 weeks' time on the same channel. Okay, my turn to say thank you very much to everybody. It's been a wonderful panel. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you. Yeah.